There are stories that arrive with a warning. And then there are stories that arrive quietly, already normalized, already discussed, already stripped of their ability to shock. This is one of those stories. You don't need to be told the name. You've heard it before. You've seen it in headlines, documentaries, comment sections, and arguments that never really went anywhere. Most people think they already know what this story is about. They're wrong. Because this story isn't about a man. It isn't even about what happened. It's about what didn't happen. After the world knew. The moment everyone was waiting for. For years, people waited for something they couldn't quite describe. Not justice in the cinematic sense. Not dramatic confrontations or public reckoning. Just resolution. A moment where everything stopped being vague. Where questions stopped circling. Where the story reached an ending instead of endlessly looping back on itself. That moment was supposed to arrive with the files. Boxes of documents, court records, transcripts, material that had been sealed, delayed, summarized, or hidden behind procedure. People believed those pages would do something. They believed the truth, once written down clearly enough, would force reality to respond. Why that belief felt reasonable. It's not naive to believe this. We're taught, from a young age, that documentation matters. If it's recorded, it exists. If it exists, it can be addressed. If it's addressed, it can be corrected. This belief is foundational to modern society. We trust paperwork more than memory, records more than testimony, processes more than people. So when the Epstein files were discussed, the assumption was simple. Once everything is on paper, something will finally change. That assumption wasn't foolish. It was conditioned. What people didn't realize. Files don't exist to tell stories. They exist to close cases. And those are not the same thing. A story seeks clarity. A case seeks completion. Completion does not require accountability. It only requires that the system can move on. That distinction is uncomfortable, but critical. The first misunderstanding. From the beginning, people misunderstood what the files represented. They imagined a singular release, a reveal, a moment where everything converged into one undeniable truth. But what arrived instead was fragmentation. Documents appeared across years, through different courts, in different contexts, with different limitations. Each release felt important on its own, but disconnected from the whole. This wasn't chaos, it was structure. How attention was diffused. Attention is powerful, but only when it's focused. When attention is spread across time, platforms, interpretations, and arguments, it loses its force. One document sparks outrage, another sparks debate, another sparks fatigue. And fatigue is where accountability goes to disappear. People didn't stop caring because they were indifferent. They stopped caring because caring stopped producing movement. Why this story feels different from other dark cases. In most dark histories, there is a moment where everything collapses. An exposure, a verdict, a consequence. Here, nothing collapsed. The system flexed and absorbed the impact. What should have been destabilizing became procedural. What should have been shocking became normalized. That's why this story feels unfinished, because it is. The illusion of knowing. Ask people today what they know about this case. They'll say, I know the basics. I've seen the documentaries. I know the names. But knowing about something is not the same as understanding how it functions. This story is not about hidden secrets. It's about visible information that never translated into action. And that's far more unsettling. Why the files didn't create closure requires an endpoint. The files did not provide one. They provided continuity. They allowed institutions to say, this is being handled. This has been reviewed. This process is ongoing. Those phrases sound reassuring. They are not. They are placeholders, designed to outlast attention. How power survives exposure. Power does not always hide. Sometimes it reveals selectively. It releases information slowly, legally, and in ways that prevent synthesis. This creates the appearance of openness while maintaining control. Nothing is denied outright. Nothing is confirmed fully. Everything exists in limbo, and limbo is where responsibility dissolves. Why this is not a conspiracy story. This story doesn't require secret meetings or hidden masterminds. It requires something simpler. Incentives. Institutions are designed to protect themselves first. Stability is prioritized over disruption. Procedure is valued over outcome. No one needs to coordinate silence. Silence emerges naturally when consequence threatens structure. The emotional aftermath. No one talks about for the public. The result was confusion. How could something so serious feel so unresolved? For victims, it was worse. Visibility did not equal relief. Documentation did not equal justice. Exposure did not equal safety. The story moved forward, but their reality stayed the same. Why this case? Still matters not because it's unresolved, but because it shows what resolution can look like in modern systems, not endings, transitions, processes that conclude without correcting anything fundamental. That's the real discomfort here. This video is not here to list events. It's here to reset your expectations. Because if you watch this story expecting answers, you'll miss the point. The real question was never, what was inside the files? The real question is, why did so much information change so little? That's where this story actually lives. Once you understand that disclosure didn't equal consequence, the next question becomes unavoidable. How? How could something so visible remain so untouchable? It was not magic. It was design. Subtle, patient, and methodical. Influence had woven itself into every layer that mattered. Courts, procedures, legal frameworks, institutional inertia. And by the time any individual could act, the machinery had already absorbed the shock. The architecture of protection influence does not need to be loud. It does not need to intimidate with obvious force. Its power lies in structure. Decisions were delayed, reviews were mandated, procedures were cited, appeals were filed, documents were shuffled, legal language created barriers, not to protect the guilty, but to protect the process. And in protecting the process, it protected those inside it. Every system has weak points. Most people try to find them. But when weak points are dispersed across multiple systems, courts, investigators, agencies, private firms, and financial intermediaries, no single person can navigate the entire network. Even if you had the files, even if you had evidence, the system was already 3 steps ahead. It's not complicated. It's bureaucratic. It's almost elegant in its simplicity. Fragmentation as a shield. The files themselves were fragmented, sections redacted, cases separated, pages scattered. Nothing existed in a neat sequence. Every reader came away with a slightly different picture. Every journalist interpreted different threads. Every lawyer focused on separate clauses. Even researchers with access could only build partial maps. Fragmentation is a shield, not because information is hidden entirely, but because it cannot be reconciled easily. When narratives can't be reconstructed, accountability becomes impossible. Attention is forced to splinter. Public outrage dilutes. Discussions loop endlessly without conclusion. And that was by design, or by the natural effect of a complex, multi-layered system. Why timing mattered. Every document arrived after months or years of delay. Every deposition followed long after events occurred. Every memo released only after legal battles had worn down attention spans. Momentum in accountability is everything. When attention peaks, the system acts. When attention fades, the system waits. And in this case, attention faded every time before resolution could arrive. The files might shock momentarily, but shock does not last in a vacuum. Without immediate consequence, documentation becomes white noise. The subtlety of influence works best when invisible. It does not demand obedience. It does not require threats. It only needs plausibility. Decisions are framed as neutral. Actions are framed as procedural. Delays are framed as standard. And every person in the chain of power can truthfully claim, "I followed the rules." This is why the system survived exposure. No one could be held directly accountable because there was no direct line to prove wrongdoing, only patterns. Patterns are uncomfortable, but they are not prosecutable. And patterns are exactly what this system left behind. Isolation of the individual. One of the most insidious effects of this environment was the isolation it created. Individuals, investigators, journalists, or witnesses were forced to navigate these layers alone. Every step required interpretation, verification, and legal maneuvering. By the time they attempted intervention, they faced delays, deferrals, and contradictions. Isolation saps energy. It erodes resolve. It teaches the mind that some battles cannot be fought, and when enough people believe they cannot fight, systems solidify. What was fragile becomes permanent. Why evidence alone was not enough. Even the most damning files, legal transcripts, sworn statements, financial documents, failed to produce clear outcomes. It was not because they were false, but because they were insufficient on their own. Evidence cannot compel action if institutions are designed to absorb it. Evidence cannot enforce accountability if the machinery interprets delay as neutrality. Evidence cannot overcome an environment where procedure is valued above consequence. And in this case, procedure was everything. The weight of public perception. Public attention was simultaneously a weapon and a weakness. Headlines amplified outrage. Social media spread stories. News cycles dissected revelations. And yet, the more the files were discussed, the more diffuse the focus became. Individual threads of responsibility became lost in a mass of commentary. Outrage without structure rarely produces change. And in this environment, the system was strong enough to turn exposure into endurance. The quiet effect on those who watched for observers, this was exhausting. Every document opened a new line of questions. Every statement was partial. Every revelation begged follow-up. And after months or years of consuming these fragments, fatigue set in. The public's capacity to demand accountability diminished, not because interest waned, but because the information environment was designed to create endless, unresolved threads. This fatigue mirrors the victim experience. When you can't see a path to resolution, you stop trying. And that is exactly where influence thrives. Networks of protection. It wasn't only legal channels. Networks of financial, political, and social influence intersected. People with power could delay or redirect scrutiny. Professionals advised discretion. Institutions mediated. Even well-intentioned investigators found themselves bound by procedure, precedent, and legal uncertainty. These networks acted like a living organism, absorbing shocks, redirecting pressure, neutralizing threats. From the outside, it looked like nothing was happening. From the inside, everything was moving carefully, but invisibly. Patterns, not people. The key takeaway is that this story is about systems, not individuals. Names can be listed, connections traced, and allegations noted, but the enduring power is structural. Fragmentation prevents synthesis, procedure absorbs disruption, networks insulate influence, attention naturally dissipates, and once the system demonstrates it can survive exposure, it rarely changes. The files didn't break the system. They proved it. The psychological impact on observers. Even for those who never had direct contact, the files created unease. Why does so much remain unresolved? Why does exposure not equal consequence? Why does knowledge produce discomfort without closure? These questions linger because they are the point. The files themselves are a mechanism of influence, not just for those involved, but for everyone trying to understand them. When the files were released, they carried an aura of revelation. People expected clarity. They expected answers. Instead, they found gaps, redactions, fragmented narratives, references without context, pages that hinted at connections but refused to confirm them. It is easy to mistake the act of disclosure for the act of understanding. But in this case, transparency was an illusion. The more documents appeared, the heavier the sense of incompleteness became. It was as if the information itself had been designed not to illuminate, but to confuse. Redactions. More than black ink redactions are often dismissed as simple obscurations, things we can't see yet, but their real effect is psychological. They are shadows cast across the mind. They signal existence without permission, hint at significance without clarity. Every blacked out line invites speculation. Every missing page prompts doubt, and every hint left unexplained becomes a trap. Attention is captured, energy is consumed, momentum stalls. Those who sought truth found themselves running in place. Each revelation promised insight, each blacked out section denied it. What emerged was not enlightenment, it was fatigue. How attention became a tool systems survive by controlling attention. By the time one document gained traction, another appeared somewhere else, diverting focus. By the time people grasped one thread, the next required interpretation, verification, or legal permission. Attention is finite. By stretching it thin, the files ensured that outrage could never concentrate enough to force systemic change. Shock became noise. Awareness became routine. And in routine, influence thrives. Fragmentation and the difficulty of synthesis. Every page, every transcript, every note was a piece of a puzzle that could never be fully assembled. Fragments arrived in isolation. Some legal, some financial, some personal. Connections existed but were obscured by procedural language. The effect was subtle but profound. Readers could observe, assess, hypothesize, but never fully understand. The system was exposed, yes, but in such a way that exposure itself became neutralized. Fragmentation is a weapon of endurance. It preserves the system while creating the impression of accountability. Why procedure outlives? Perception procedure is the architecture of institutional survival. It doesn't require malice. It doesn't require concealment. It simply requires consistency. By moving slowly, by documenting meticulously, and by adhering to formalities, institutions created an environment where nothing could be contested quickly, where delay was normal, where lack of resolution was interpreted as due diligence. This is the genius of endurance. The system did not fight visibility. It absorbed it. Exposure became part of the procedure, and by doing so, it neutralized the potential for disruption. Networks that insulate influence beyond bureaucracy. Networks of influence created invisible armor. Lawyers, intermediaries, financial managers, and connected advisors formed a lattice that redirected scrutiny. Each actor was bound by protocol, obligation, or professional discretion. Individually, each step appeared neutral or justified. Collectively, they formed a shield. To break such a network requires precision, persistence, and unity, conditions rarely met in public scrutiny. The files provided fragments, but never the full map. Why knowing the facts was never enough. The release of information rarely translated to action. Evidence could exist, but context was always partial. Transactions were recorded but not fully explained. Meetings were noted but not described in purpose. Connections appeared without confirmed outcomes. Knowledge became weight without leverage. Observers understood that something systemic had occurred, but could not compel consequences. And that inability to compel is the subtlest, darkest form of influence. It is power that survives scrutiny because scrutiny itself is insufficient. The psychological effect on the public. For those following the story, the effect was disorienting. The more they read, the less certain they felt. Pieces of the puzzle seemed significant, but the full picture remained just out of reach. This is what makes exposure feel hollow. Seeing evidence without consequence creates dissonance. You know there is truth, but you cannot act on it. And when action is impossible, attention fades. The system survives, not through secrecy, but through controlled visibility. Patterns over individuals' names were present. Events were listed. Allegations were recorded. But these were not the essence of the story. The essence was pattern. Fragmented information, procedural inertia, redaction and delayed diffusion of attention, structural insulation. These patterns ensured that exposure remained ineffective. Individual culpability could be debated, delayed, or minimized. But the network itself endured. The cost of comprehension. Even those closest to the files, investigators, journalists, researchers, found themselves caught in cycles of partial understanding. Each breakthrough was paired with uncertainty. Each connection created new questions. Comprehension itself became exhausting. To read was to be trapped in the structure. To understand was to recognize the futility of action without collective, sustained effort. And that exhaustion is precisely the system's point. The system's a living organism. This was not a static bureaucracy. It behaved like a living organism. It adjusted to exposure, redistributed pressure, and absorbed attempts at interference. Transparency did not threaten it. Disclosure was neutralized. Documentation became an internal reinforcement of endurance rather than a call to action. Every page released confirmed one uncomfortable reality. The structure was self-protecting. The system survived by ensuring the illusion of openness while keeping accountability inaccessible. Why this matters beyond the headlines? This story is unsettling because it teaches a lesson broader than any single individual. It shows how systems can manipulate visibility, control perception, and absorb scrutiny without overt resistance. It is not a story of hidden evil. It is a story of procedural power. It is not about dramatic confrontation. It is about endurance. And endurance is harder to detect, harder to oppose, and far more dangerous in the long term than the chaos of a single visible act. Once the system had insulated itself, the next mechanism of endurance became clear. Perception, not secrecy, not concealment. Perception. How events, documents, and disclosures were received or ignored became as important as what was actually hidden. It was never about keeping people in the dark. It was about keeping them off balance, providing just enough information to satisfy curiosity, yet never enough to compel action. The files existed not to expose a conspiracy, They existed to create one in the mind of the observer. The pieces were there, connections hinted, moments recorded, but understanding, that remained elusive. The illusion of transparency. Transparency can be weaponized. By appearing open while controlling the flow of information, a system can create the impression of accountability without the substance. Each page released, each redaction applied, each procedural note posted publicly contributed to this illusion. For observers, the impression was clear. Something is being done. Action is underway. Investigation is thorough. And yet, the outcomes never match the promise. This illusion is disorienting. It teaches patience while eroding hope. It creates trust in process while dissolving faith in result. And when faith erodes, resistance diminishes. Redaction as psychological strategy. Redactions were more than legal necessities. They were instruments of control. Every blacked out line, every removed name, every omitted detail performed a silent act. It reminded the public that knowledge is limited, that control remains unseen, that even exposure can be filtered. Redactions created gaps that observers instinctively wanted to fill. Each gap became a seed of speculation. And speculation is powerless unless it converges into coordinated action, which the system ensured would never happen. By manipulating perception, the system allowed disclosure to occur without consequence. Transparency became a tool of endurance, not reform. Timing and the erosion of attention information is only dangerous when it compels immediate response. Delays in release, staggered publication, and asynchronous reporting ensured that attention was fragmented. By the time the public had grasped one document, another appeared somewhere else, leading to cognitive exhaustion. By the time outrage built, momentum had dissipated. This is why attention, as much as procedure, was a shield. Systems survive best when scrutiny is fragmented, delayed, and never fully concentrated. Normalization of exposure. Repeated exposure to partial information creates a paradox. At first, shock is intense. Names, allegations, and implications generate outrage. But repetition without consequence teaches the mind to accept the abnormal. What should provoke action becomes routine. What should unsettle becomes background noise. This is the quietest, most effective form of endurance, not by silencing, but by normalizing. The fragmentation of responsibility was diffused across networks. Legal intermediaries, advisors, institutions, and procedural norms created layers between action and consequence. Even when evidence was accessible, the observer could not connect the threads. Connections existed, but proving causality required coordination the system had already made improbable. Fragmentation became a protective lattice. No individual could confront the whole. No public outcry could assemble the scattered pieces. And yet, fragments were enough to convince observers that the files contained the truth, even if the truth could not be fully accessed. The psychological impact of partial knowledge. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures. When confronted with incomplete information, the mind attempts to reconstruct the whole. In this case, reconstruction was impossible. The system ensured it. Observers oscillated between outrage, confusion, and resignation. They recognized injustice, but could not act on it. The files generated awareness without consequence, exposure without resolution, knowledge without closure. This was deliberate, even if unintentional. The system operated under a principle: visible does not equal vulnerable. Networks beyond the documents. Even beyond what the files revealed, influence persisted through connections, reputation, and authority. Lawyers could advise, institutions could defer, and observers were constrained by process. The network acted like an organism. Pressure applied in one area was absorbed, redirected, or neutralized. Public scrutiny was filtered through layers of procedure and legality. Transparency existed, but it could not threaten structural integrity. What seemed like protection of individuals was actually protection of systems, and systems are far more durable than personalities. Why fragmentation sustained control? Fragmentation served a dual purpose. It protected the network while conditioning observers. It obscured direct causality. It ensured that exposure could be discussed endlessly without producing change. It created uncertainty that discouraged action. Each fragment was a mirror, reflecting only partial truth. Observers saw themselves in the gaps, questioning understanding, doubting memory, and losing confidence in intervention. The endurance of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is resilient because it is procedural. It does not need malevolence. It thrives on consistency. Every delay, every review, every cross-reference contributed to endurance. The system did not resist exposure through secrecy. It resisted by being relentless in its own terms. Procedure became protection. Transparency became insulation. Attention became managed. This is why the files, despite their volume, produced minimal disruption. The mechanisms of endurance were subtle but absolute. The quiet lessons for observers. The story of the Epstein files is unsettling because it is not about dramatic exposure. It is about the survival of structure. Those who studied the files learned this slowly. Awareness of procedural defense creates unease. Recognition that systems can absorb outrage without change creates frustration. And understanding that exposure alone does not equal consequence teaches a dark truth. Endurance often outlasts attention. The implication for accountability: when exposure becomes procedural, accountability becomes optional. Even when evidence exists, even when patterns are visible, the observer cannot compel change. Legal and institutional buffers ensure that consequence is uncertain, delayed, or neutralized. Accountability requires synthesis, momentum, and concentration of attention. 3 things the files deliberately or inherently disrupted. The files were there. Everyone could see them. Thousands of pages, legal transcripts, financial records, names redacted, connections implied, events referenced, moments chronicled. And yet, for all the documentation, for all the visibility, the outcome remained the same. Nothing ended. This is the cruel paradox. The world watched. The evidence was out in the open. But systems had already learned how to endure. Exposure, once thought to be the great equalizer, had become a tool of survival. The weight of visibility without consequence. To witness something and be unable to affect it is a deeply unsettling experience. For the public, it created a sense of helplessness. For observers, even those who understood patterns and networks, the files became a maze of frustration. Everything was visible, yet nothing could be acted upon. Every thread suggested wrongdoing, yet every pathway to consequence was blocked, delayed, or neutralized. Information existed, but influence remained insulated. Awareness coexisted with impotence. Redactions and the power of absence. The black bars across pages were more than legal necessities. They were signals. They reminded the reader that there was more, something important, but inaccessible. Absence became as powerful as presence. Each omission reinforced the sense of a structure beyond reach, beyond action. People wanted to know, but they could not. And the inability to act, repeated over and over, created a slow erosion of attention, motivation, and outrage. how fragmentation became a shield. The files were never released as a complete narrative. Instead, they arrived in fragments. One caught here, a sealed motion there, a redacted transcript somewhere else. No central archive, no narrative thread. Fragmentation created a system where understanding required extraordinary effort. And even with effort, full comprehension was impossible. Observers could follow pieces, but never the whole. They could speculate, hypothesize, and reconstruct, but real closure remained out of reach. Fragmentation protected influence. Fragmentation preserved the network. Fragmentation neutralized consequence. The role of timing in endurance time was an invisible ally. Each document, delayed by months or years, arrived after the moment of potential action had passed. By the time attention focused on one set of files, another had arrived, scattering focus, diluting outrage, and creating fatigue. Momentum, the essential element of accountability, never aligned with the flow of information. Shock was temporary, interest waned, scrutiny fragmented, and the system endured. Networks that absorb exposure. Beyond legal procedure, influence relied on networks. Lawyers, advisors, administrators, and intermediaries all acted in concert, whether intentionally or by structure. These networks redirected attention, ensured delays, and provided cover under the guise of due diligence. The genius of this system was invisibility. Each action could be defended as neutral, reasonable, or procedural. Individually, nothing appeared malicious. Collectively, everything became protective. The psychological toll of partial knowledge exposure without consequence has a quiet, cumulative effect. Observers internalize doubt. They question memory, interpretation, and possibility. Every fragment of truth becomes a puzzle piece that cannot fit. Awareness turns into anxiety, curiosity into frustration, understanding into helplessness. This is the deepest form of endurance. The system survives because knowledge alone is insufficient. Understanding does not compel action. Awareness does not equal resolution. Transparency as endurance. This is the most chilling aspect. The files were transparent, but in a controlled way. Transparency did not disrupt the system, it reinforced it. Information was public, but the structure ensured that insight could not translate into consequence. Visibility became endurance. Disclosure became protection. Knowledge became neutralized. The files themselves were a tool of survival, a mechanism to maintain stability while creating the illusion of exposure. Why nothing changed? No single actor needed to resist accountability overtly. No massive cover-up was necessary. The system was resilient by design. Procedure, fragmentation, timing, and perception worked together to preserve continuity. Even when observers knew patterns of wrongdoing, the dispersed nature of responsibility meant action was nearly impossible. Redactions protected individuals while maintaining structure. Delays dispersed attention. Fragmentation created confusion. Networks provided subtle insulation. The system did not need to hide. It only needed to continue operating normally, and normalcy itself became the shield. The public reaction and fatigue. At first, public interest surged. Headlines were alarming. Social media buzzed. Discussions proliferated. But as documents trickled in, contradictions appeared, and context remained partial. Fatigue set in. The public learned to accept incompleteness. Shock dulled into routine. Outrage diminished. And by the time awareness returned, the network had already absorbed the scrutiny. This is the quiet victory of endurance. The system outlasts attention. The structural lessons. This case teaches that accountability requires more than evidence. Evidence is only dangerous when synthesis, momentum, and concentrated action exist. Without those, exposure can be observed, analyzed, and even documented, but never acted upon. The Epstein files reveal not a single failure, but a series of structural protections: fragmented information, procedural absorption of scrutiny, timing designed to dissipate focus, networks that redirect attention, redactions that create gaps, not transparency. Together, these patterns preserved influence even in the most visible environment. The lasting impact on observers. Those who followed the files closely experienced a subtle, persistent disquiet. Knowing there was evidence, understanding the structure, and still seeing no consequence is psychologically destabilizing. It teaches an unsettling lesson. Visibility does not equal justice. Exposure does not equal accountability. Knowledge does not equal power. And that lesson, more than any single document or revelation, is the true weight of the Epstein files. The final reckoning, when the world watched, when the files were accessible, when awareness peaked, the system endured. The files proved one thing conclusively: power does not require secrecy to survive. It requires structure, patience, and endurance. The public may know, observers may understand, but knowledge alone cannot dismantle the mechanisms of survival. And the lesson is clear, dark, and uncomfortable. Some systems are designed not to be broken, no matter how visible their faults. This is the real story the Epstein files tell. Not about scandal, not about crime, not about names or documents. It is about the endurance of influence in plain sight, and the chilling truth that exposure alone is rarely enough to create justice.